Shall I start? We'll start with an apology that I can't stay longer because of some personal matters. And I'll welcome you all to this event. I thought how to actually open this event on unwritten constitutions. And I have to be honest that I have two nationalities, two countries with unwritten constitutions. So that's my relation to this conference. I am delighted. I think it's a celebration today to see the students and to see the staff who came from abroad celebrating the publication of Amending America's Unwritten Constitution, edited by Richard Aubrey, Ryan, William, and my good friend Yaniv Radzyner. I can say many things about unwritten constitutions as a layman, so I decided not to do this. But definitely leave it to you to further explore. But in any case, I think we are all citizens of countries where constitutional difficulties are part of our daily reality. Hopefully some can be resolved in the near future. I'll stop here and I'll give the stage to you. And good luck with the conference and happy to see you all.
Thank you, Lior. Thank you so much. Meital, you taking the lead?
Yeah. I will present all the speakers and then we can start. Professor Margit Cohn is Henry J. and Fannie Harkavy Chair in Comparative Law at the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University. Daniel Greenberg is CB Counsel for Domestic Legislation in the House of Commons, UK Parliament. Tsvi is an Associate Professor at the Ono Academic College and an expert on Canadian constitutional law. Lior is an Associate Professor and the Dean of the Faculty of Law at Ramat Center for Business and Law. Iddo is an Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law at Ramat Center for Business.
And we have, we're actually starting with Mark is giving the first lecture.
Great.
So let me present Mark, who is the Regent Professor at Maryland University, and I've asked Mark is also a visiting professor here at Reichman University for these 2 weeks, and he wrote one of the most important chapters in this book about the unwritten constitutions of the US. So I've asked Mark to give the keynote lecture that would start or kick off this debate. So Mark, you have like 20 minutes or so to open the floor, and then we will open with the panel of discussion surrounding the topic. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Well, first, thank you very, very much, and this is a triple thank you. The first thank you is really honored to be part of the volume. There's just a lot of terrific essays, terrific people, a lot of terrific perspectives. It's well recommended, particularly when it comes out in paperback, because I know what Cambridge charges for hardback. The second thank you is when you reach a certain age, there is the first priority at any conference, which would be in a city where one of your children is. And so I'm very grateful that the first conference that was held with this was in Boston, so I could see my daughter Rebecca. And the second priority is to hold a conference in a place you really want to go, Israel. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, in one sense, this is a bit of a bizarre occasion. Why should we have a book launch in Israel for a book entitled Amending America's Unwritten Constitution? Now, one answer is obvious. People at Reichman are very good colleagues. So if a colleague at Reichman had written a book on water rights in Wyoming, Kalamazoo, and someplace I've never heard of, there would be a book launch and people politely would show up. But I think with this book, there's more than simply the United States, and not simply because Mark Tushman has written a comparative chapter. Let me suggest two broader take-homes from my essay. The first is it turns out everybody has an unwritten constitution. Everybody has a written constitution. In some cases, the balance may be different, but the difference between written constitutional regimes and unwritten constitutional regimes is less than meets the eye. A second is all regimes have constitutions, plural. That the constitution of the legal profession is not the constitution of the leader of the political movement. It is not the constitution of a member of parliament, and it's not sufficient in a law school that we simply teach them the Constitution in the courts, because as lawyers, they will have many roles and they need to understand the interactions of the different constitutions. In particular, they need to understand, I'll argue, the interaction of constitutional law with what I call the working constitution. I'll get to it at the end. The working constitution is the set of political arrangements that generates answers to constitutional questions and implements constitutional functions. And this is extraordinarily important, and we can tell in both Israel and in the United States, polarization has dramatically changed the way the Constitution works, and so it has dramatically changed the way the Constitution generates answers. And if you don't like the answers, the Israeli constitutional regime, the United States constitutional regime, the Brazilian constitutional regime is generating, you can't simply go before a judge and say, I have an argument all my colleagues think is very good. Be persuaded and expect, as I think some of my colleagues do, that if we just make the right argument, Justice Clarence Thomas, the most conservative justice on the American Supreme Court, will get down on his knees and wail, oh my God, for 30 years I have handed down wrong decisions. How can you ever forgive me? Not going to happen. We need to think about changing the politics that generates a world in which, if you are a particular progressive, which I am, Netanyahu is prime minister, Clarence Thomas is part of the majority of the court. So briefly, all constitutions have unwritten elements. In some ways this is simple. The Constitution of the United States. Where in the Constitution of the United States does it say this Constitution is written in English? And if it did say this Constitution is written in English, how do we know the words, this Constitution is written in English, are not ancient Klingon for this Constitution is written in ancient Klingon? In other words, it's something outside the text we bring in to interpret the text. Now that's a rather silly problem, but here's a serious version. It's called the Constitution of the United States, but we could label lots of things the Constitution of the United States. How do we know this is the Constitution of the United States? Here is a wrong answer. The Constitution meets its internal conditions. It's the Constitution of the United States because Article 7 says, this Constitution shall be valid law if ratified in a certain way. Well, it just so happens I have written a Constitution of the United States. It has its own Article 7. And Article 7 says this Constitution shall be the law of the United States when I count down from 5. Are you watching? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Is my Constitution good law? It meets its internal criteria for validity. So what I hope to get is every Constitution needs external support for its validity, its principles of interpretation. But there's another aspect of constitutions that require external validation. One of the things we know about contracts is that a contract may not be valid if the parties made material assumptions together that turned out to be wrong. So we sign a contract for the sale of a cow that we're convinced is over there. Turns out there's no cow over there. There's no contract. Now, one of the things that's very rarely studied is what is the empirical foundations of constitutional text. I start silly, then I get serious. The silly version. The Constitution says in the United States, every state shall have 2 senators. We think we know what a state is. Okay? What happens? The earthquake finally occurs. All of the landmass we know of California falls into the ocean. Does California get 2 senators? Now, we can play around for hours about that, but the best answer is, the Constitution was written on the assumption that states don't fall into the ocean. Now, the more serious version. The powers of the president in Article 2. Does every president have those powers? What about the incompetent, bigoted president? We know Article 2 was designed to ensure, to the extent humanly possible, that the president would have certain capabilities. What happens if the president doesn't have those capabilities? And it's well known throughout the political regime. The president lacks those capabilities. Do we read Article 2 as saying the incompetent, bigoted president shall have the same powers of Abraham Lincoln no matter what? Well, Sandy Levinson and I wrote a paper saying that's not the right reading. And a lot of people said, how could you possibly say that? No one could believe it. But I submit 2 pieces of evidence that we are right about practice. First, we know more Trump executive orders were overturned by courts than any other president. And we know they were often overturned for reasons that would justify overturning other presidential edicts. The courts clearly did not allow President Trump the same Article 2 powers as everyone else. Well, that's the courts. It's all well known. The courts are staffed by oppositional people. What we learned was that Trump administration officials regularly refused to carry out orders, regularly refused to report presidential orders. they thought were just too far. They behaved as if the incompetent, bigoted president lacked the power of any other president. There just is more resistance and more quasi-legal resistance to Trump that indeed suggests that when a president lacks the qualities all people anticipate in a president, that president doesn't have as much power as others. Well, the second point is sort of the different constitutions. So think of the law school constitution. Here I think of the law school constitution of the United States. It's not identical to the written text. Students are told the preamble. Now, that you don't litigate that. Students are told at the end, there's a clause saying, and we now sign this document in the year of our Lord, 1787. Well, if we take that as legal, guess what? This is a Christian country, not my Lord. I suspect not the Lord of a lot of people sitting in the room. That's not legal. There are a lot of clauses that no longer exist. There are a lot of clauses that are lapsed. There are a lot of clauses that never go to court. It turns out the legal constitution we teach our students is about, 20% of the text. That in just an awful lot of common law books, you see ... Not part of the legal constitution. But it gets even worse when we take the Constitution out of court. Every good lawyer in the United States knows you do not base a constitutional argument on the Declaration of Independence. You may say we ought to interpret the jury clause broadly, given the Declaration of Independence, but we don't say right to jury, see Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is not part of fundamental law in the United States. Move across the street to the White House, to Congress, and the Declaration of Independence is the final authority. More generally, how people understand what is the Constitution of the United States, what right it protects, is very different than what is the text. And yet, you may rely on the text in court, but if we take the Constitution as fundamental law, and we know 98% of all constitutional issues never get to court, those 98% are resolved by the Constitution out of court, which is very different than the Constitution in the courts. Well, lastly, the constitution of particular regimes. We might understand the regime as defined by two things. The first is a set of understandings, conventions, superstatutes, superprecedents about what is fundamental at this time. The Constitution does not say the Supreme Court shall have 9 and only 9 justices, but people understand, yes, 9, do not tinker with the number. It has become a convention. Constitution does not clearly say we cannot separate children by race in schools. Brown v. Board of Education was controversial throughout most of American history. Woe be to the lawyer or to the political actor who says, you know, Brown, we ought to revisit it. Woe be to the lawyer who says, let's get rid of Social Security. There is no right to Social Security in the written text. There is, however, a right to Social Security in the popular understanding. It doesn't matter whether it's in the written text or not. It is just as fundamental as the right to free speech. Second element is the politics that supports it. All constitutions rely on a politics for three things, and it's entirely unwritten, or unwritten for the most part. First, you need a politics to support the clear meaning of the Constitution. You need to develop some kind of political system that will make sure if you say the president is inaugurated on January 20th, the president gets inaugurated on January 20th. Second, you need a politics that will resolve good faith disagreements over the meaning of the Constitution. Now you may think the politics is simply supposed to resolve those things, right. But it may be that in fact the politics is supposed to resolve those disagreements in ways that reflect certain values and interests. So the right party wins, the right side wins, or the resolution is such that we can all continue. Third and most important, constitutions advance lots of goals that can't be summarized in rules. So to tell a story, it really occurred with Adult League Softball. I'm going to tell the soccer version of it because more people may understand, and it's also a World Cup. I'm playing on the faculty soccer team, and for some reason I'm in goal, and we're now in penalty shots. And I know some emeritus professor is going to turn to me and say, Mark, we really need you to stop that next shot. And I'm always, when that happens, in baseball, there's, Mark, we really need you to get a hit. I'm always thinking to myself, the response really ought to be, you know, now that I contemplate this, yes, I should try to stop the next shot. I should try to get a hit. And here I was thinking, yeah, let the guy get a goal, make him feel better. And then after getting that sage advice, I can guarantee you in baseball, I struck out, and if I played soccer, Lionel Messi is scoring on it. In other words, the statement of the goal, in absence of the capacity to obtain the goal, is utterly worthless, or close to worthless. So one of the things, the most important thing constitutions are designed to do, is get a set of characters that can grow the economy, that can preserve domestic peace, that can do it in a way that the nation doesn't fall apart. But that isn't done by constitutional command. That is done by the structure and by the nature of politics. And one of the things we know, and this goes to amending unwritten constitutions, is the structure changes. So just to give one last of how the structure changed in the United States, I suspect there's a similar story in Israel with variations, but here it is. For most of the 20th century, the United States had fairly non-ideological parties. I was a Northern Republican. I had far more in common with Northern Democrats like my parents, this was my form of adolescent rebellion, by the way, than I did with Southern Republicans. The parties were non-ideological. The fundamental cleavage in American politics was between elites and non-elites. Republican and Democratic elites thought more like each other than they did the mass base of the party. Well, who sits on the Supreme Court? Elites. So it turns out for a number of years it didn't matter whether it was Republican presidents or Democratic presidents appointed. You got an elite, and elite was a certain kind of liberal. And so, Brown versus Board of Education, free speech cases, and elites began to think the court is the form of principle. Why the court always did what elites thought was right, or did it most of the time. What has happened over the past 50 years? We now have a politics of polarization. If anything, Republican elites are more different than Democratic elites, than ordinary Republicans, ordinary Democrats. Now a court with a Republican majority looks wildly conservative. A court with a Democratic majority looks wildly liberal. And again, what's the bottom line? It's the reason the court has changed is not simply somebody made a set of arguments about the written Constitution and 5 people said, you know, that's right. But the structure of politics has changed. And so the bottom line of how do you amend an unwritten Constitution is not simply by making better arguments of the form that get published in law reviews and convince everyone around this table, wow, you're really smart. The way constitutions and unwritten constitutions are amended is you develop platforms that mobilize and persuade your non-academic neighbors and form majorities within or overthrowing the present regime. Thank you very much.
Mark, do you want to take some questions now for you, or are you leave it to the end for the discussion?
This is your show.
Okay, so I think we can move to the discussion and then have a general discussion.
Okay, so I'll abuse my chairness, and I'd like to ask you something. I really like the argument, and I completely agree with it. But as a person who is always about the normative aspects of things in the world, I would like to ask you, what is the normative limits of this attempt? So you say that there are a lot of sources, political sources, cultural sources, normative sources for this unwritten constitution.
Okay.
You can go to capitalism and sport and other kind of sources. So is there any limit to these sources, or is it like an endless kind of plate of sources? I'll just forward and now
How you want to do it?
yeah, okay. So and now I think that all these speakers will speak one after another.
Right. Thanks, Meital. Thanks all. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very honored to participate in this panel on this wonderful book. I had the opportunity of reading several chapters, and I found it very, very interesting. Of course, I'm going to focus on Mark's wonderful chapter, so I don't need to repeat, but I'll just mention some of the catchwords, okay? Conventions, statutes, super statutes, judicial precedents, values and norms of action, a host of constructs that can be interpreted as unwritten parts of the Constitution's influence. So what I'm going to do is I'm continuing this path. It's sort of an extension of what Mark does, but focusing on the executive and his or her powers under this written, unwritten kind of division. So first of all, I'm not offering much of a novel analysis here, except the fact that I will want to focus on the possible difference, I'm not sure, between those constructs or whatever that can be construed as part of the open-ended Constitution, and those that seem to clash or be in breach of the constitutional provision. Again, it can be, the provision can be very, very openly interpreted. So I'm going to the United States Constitution. I'm not going to follow the whole thing. Article 2, very open-ended. Vesting clause is open-ended. The provisions can be interpreted. I'm not going to go there. There's a lot being done, and there's a lot going to be done on this anyway in the future. I would just want to do, because I have what, 10 minutes?
Yes.
I would just want to focus on 2 examples of so-called unwritten constructs or norms or conventions or whatever that seem not to be in accord with the Constitution itself. So one of them I think is very well known, the other possibly less so. So I'll just say a few words on executive agreements and the like. As I suppose all of us know, under Article 2, Section 2, treaties should receive the concurrence of the Senate. It's not approval, it's concurrence. It's slightly different. But I think we all know, or at least I'm going to tell you, that very few such treaties or transnational agreements are being made today. Several constructs have appeared. Some of them are unilateral, like sole agreements or executive agreements. Some of them, so-called congressional executive agreements, have some kind of collaboration between the President and Congress, but absolutely unlike the process we see in the Constitution. And I'm not going to talk about what the courts have thought about. It's different views about this. I'm really being more descriptive than anything else. I have a normative angle to that, but I don't have time for that. So this is one. We know that purely constitution-based treaties are a rarity. A 2019 study shows that in the first 50 years of independence of the United States, there were 69% of all transnational arrangements were done under Article 2. In the last, from 1990 to 2012, only 6.9%. So it has really plummeted. The constitution-based agreement is basically defunct, almost. So that's the first example. I'll be saying a bit more about signing statements and their predecessors. So this I have a handout. I think I have enough copies for everybody.
We can share.
I have too many handouts. That's okay. Now, you can follow me. You can just read the handout if you feel it's more tempting. Sometimes that's the case, but that's okay. Freedom of choice is important. So what I'm going to talk now is what's called signing statement, but I'm going to talk first about the predecessors. They're all about the question of how can the president influence policy when existing policy of Congress doesn't really seem suitable to his or her eyes. So what we had, say, in the first half, more of the 20th century, there was this practice of impoundment of funds, which meant that the president decided not to spend certain funds appropriated by Congress. Impounded meaning he sort of struck them out. Now, this was actually prohibited by a statute in 1974 after a marked rise in this practice, but some researchers say there still is this practice has not completely gone out of the window. The next step of presidents who tried to be more influential in policy making was the line item veto, a statute in this case, enacted by President Clinton, under which the president could cancel discretionary expenditure items or tax benefits contained in those enacted by Congress. This too was found unconstitutional for being contrary to the principle of separation of powers. So this went out of the window, hence the return and the reestablishment of what's called a signing statement. Now, a signing statement is something that presidents sometimes add to their signature on a certain statute. They're not very happy with the statute, but they know that they don't have any option politically. Their veto will not pass. So what you do is you add certain comments, and the comments can be quite scathing, critical. The example I have given here on the handout, did everybody have a copy? Yes. Well, I'm selling the rest for the highest bidder. Okay, so what we have here is maybe an extreme example, but we were talking about President Trump, so I decided to show you what he does here in addition to his signature. Now, what was this? This Appropriations Act was finally enacted after the 2018 shutdown, government shutdown, in the absence of an appropriation. So he capitulated, but there was no way he wasn't going to say what he thinks about some of them. So expressing dissatisfaction with a statute sometimes contains more than a hint about the presidential view of non-constitutionality of some of those provisions. Now, no, we're talking about an Appropriations Act, but I think I'm going to do some work on this. Appropriations Act in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere, contain provisions that direct action, authorize action. They're not just about money. So they're pretty substantial. It's not really not only about money. So, I think the most extreme one here, let's look at paragraph 3. That's not the most extreme one. The statute, the Appropriation Act, requires the president to negotiate international agreements in a certain way, in certain circumstances. Now the president says, my administration will treat each of these provisions consistent with the president's constitutional authorities with respect to foreign relations. Which fact? But it basically means I'm doing what I want because this is my power under the Constitution. The one I like, or don't like, is President Trump's statement that powers that require certain funds to be given out in certain conditions, he says, I'm not going into the details because there's no time. My administration will continue the practice of treating provisions like these as advisory and non-binding. Advisory and non-binding. So this goes really far, as far as I'm not going to operate this. Not only is that I'm not going to act according to this, this is not binding on me. This is legalese, you know. Now, I'm not saying that Trump was the only president involved in this practice. We have signing statements starting with the first years of the United States. But I want to note that in his administration, Trump issued 69 statements. That's an average of 17 per year, while President Biden has issued 4, all into 2021. He also has a signing statement linked with his Appropriations Act, but the language is much more tempered. He will say, I'll just give you one example. Congress was really very unhappy with the idea that Guantanamo Bay is going to be disbanded, okay, and that the government will be able to send people out to either to their home countries or elsewhere. So the way he says it is that in some circumstances, these provisions could make it difficult to comply with the final judgment of the court, which has directed freeing through habeas corpus. And he ends notwithstanding I disagree, I will not apply this, I urge the Congress to eliminate these restrictions as soon as possible. So the tone is much more limited. But the idea of a signing statement, we are going to link it with the Constitution. What we see in the Constitution is merely the following. This is how statutes are to be enacted. This is what the president has to do. He or she can either veto and this can go back to the Senate or sign it. So this, and also the previous examples, are examples of practices that certainly are part of what Mark called unwritten constitutions. But they are also contrary, seem to be contrary to the Constitution. Unless we say, okay, the Constitution provides for the enactment of treaties with the concurrence of the Senate. But it doesn't say anything that prohibits the president to act unilaterally. Now, one of my pet subjects, if not the best pet, is about these kind of unilateral actions by the administration. Now, I don't think I have much time, if at all.
2 minutes, sorry.
I would have loved to do a similar analysis about the British Constitution. Actually, in the book I wrote, we have an esteemed representation here. So I will only mention Israel's arrangement on this, which most of us here know about. Section 32 of the basically called the government. You can see it on page 2 in the handout. Now, this seems to authorize the government to act with outside of statute, but not against statute. But we also know the courts have set some restraints on the use of this section. I'm not going to go into them. The question would be, again, following Mark's analysis, if these constraints set by the courts, by the Supreme Court, are also parts of the unwritten Constitution. I would possibly argue that they are. Now, final comment. How do we like the situation? I don't like it, let's say. Okay? I'm really sort of a legalistic person. I believe that if we have a written Constitution, then things should be going according to the Constitution. Okay, nobody asks me what I think, but that's what I think. Now, but we know politics do not work this way. So the only thing I can add, I show in my book how dangerous these practices can be for working democracy. And I dedicate a chapter to my argument that courts should be actually strengthened and be invited to enable vibrant discussion in the public. But this is a completely different issue that I could talk about for about the next 2 hours, but I won't. In short, I fully agree with Mark. There is no constitution that is merely paper and the words written on it. It's problematic, but life is problematic. So I'm not trying to find a miracle cure for all our ills. Just let's be aware of some of these ills. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll come around here so people can see me. I'm just going to add 2 comments, if I may, to what Professor Greenberg has already said. Although I will preface by congratulating him and Yaniv and the others involved in this supremely illuminating volume. And I only have 2 things to add to what he said. Professor Graeber said that there is, of course, there's no wholly written constitution, there's no wholly unwritten constitution. I would take that a little bit further. There's no such thing as a constitution, by which I mean either the totality of law is constitutional law, or no law is constitutional law. And the point of this is that the law, the state, is the totality of law, and the rule of law depends primarily on trivia. And of course, we now have the very best example in Parliament in the United Kingdom. We have always been obsessed with where policemen can and can't go, and where our doorkeepers can and can't go in their fancy uniform. And we've always been pedantic about it. And some people have dared to suggest that it is a minor point of trivia, until the point in our history when the question of whether the guards who are responsible for the security of the Capitol building take their instructions from the head of government for the time being, or from those more resilient voices to which Professor Graeber refers. Subject to that, America would be a former democracy today. There was half an hour where the rule of law hung on that particular trivial detail. Everything is constitutional. A rule about legal aid in family proceedings. Well, legal aid is access to the courts, and access to the courts is the Constitution. The courts are the Constitution. So the bottom line is, there ain't no such thing as the Constitution. Our judges tried, in our Metric Martyrs case, the judges tried to define constitutional statutes and non-constitutional statutes. When I say the judges, I mean one judge who perhaps thought he could sort of retire and write books about it, and his colleagues just weren't interested, because it's nonsense, it doesn't help anyone. And the bottom line is, as I said to a select committee once, law is law is law is law is law. My children said, how could you possibly make them listen to you say law is law is law is law is law? But it's terribly important, because as lawyers, the temptation to be tempted into to draw down, well, that's constitutional, so it's special. That's intellectual property law, so it's special. No, law is one thing. And in terms of an unwritten constitution or a written constitution, what matters is that we see the totality of the law relating to the state and its functions as of equal importance, of equal fragility, and of equal constitutionality. My second point is simply this, that flows from the first point. When we talk about amending a written constitution, an unwritten constitution, what we very often encounter is people who want to codify certain aspects of the unwritten constitution and render them into a written state. And Professor Graeber drew attention to the concept of convention as being what surrounds the application of constitutional law. But when you take something that is previously in an unwritten form with all the recognition and convention the judges and others have built up, and you codify it, you're not codifying it, you're killing it. Right? If you take a tiger and you put it in a cardboard box, you're basically killing the tiger. And constitutional law, despite the fact that it's no different from any other law, it has to remain appropriately flexible. And in the case of law about politics, it has to remain as flexible as politics and as capable of developing as politics is and as politics changes. So there ain't no such thing as codifying law. Sometimes you decide that you need to put the tiger in the box, and that's okay. But you have to acknowledge that that is what you're doing. And you mustn't pretend that all you're doing is writing down what the law is and therefore nothing's changed. By writing it down, you are changing it beyond all recognition, and you just have to sit back and listen to the tiger whimper. Those are my 2 points, and they're inevitable for me to make because as a drafter of law, I believe law is law is law, and what matters is not whether it's written or unwritten or judge-made or unjudge-made. It's got to be clear, certain, and useful.
Can you explain us what the CB is for? Because I was asked, and I tried to explain, but
It means I was very kindly created a companion of the Order of the Bar by her.
Thank you. Very well.
Thank you, Lee, for having me. Thank you, students, for listening to us. Let me start from a little discrepancy in the difference. The book is called Amending America's Constitution. The evening is called Amending the Constitution. And so I'm working with that difference, I'm actually going to bring a Canadian perspective, because I spent many years in Canada, and I still write about Canada, even though I teach in Israel. And I want to share with you something that you may or may not know, I may not know. But the answer to the question how you amend an unwritten principle sometimes may be by appointing conservative judges. So what happens in Canada in the past 5 years or so may end up happening, but on a much stronger, more acute sense in Israel, which is a decision for whatever reason that the court is too activist / liberal, and more conservative judges should be appointed. And this actually happened in the past 5 years. The Supreme Court of Canada, its majority has shifted from being clearly, I wouldn't say activist, I would say liberal and egalitarian, to a court whose majority is more conservative. Now, it's not like Israel in the sense, you don't feel it in blatant issues like the notwithstanding clause or imprisoning people that you shouldn't imprison or other harsh human rights violations. But you feel it on small things, which is a matter of my work that I'm not about here. But maybe I'll get to it, I'm not sure about that. But one of the things where the conservative judges changed the law is actually exactly about this, the unwritten principles. And so going also to Daniel's presentation, the judges wrote a very legalistic decision on unwritten principles. And what they said in that decision is something like this. So in Canada, I should say, there is a detailed constitution. Most of the constitution is written. But there are two cases, one in the 1997, one in 1998, that did create unwritten principles. The first decision, I won't get into the details, but the first decision struck down legislation. Actually struck down. It said, we say that this law is unconstitutional not because it is inconsistent with a specific provision of the Constitution, but because it is consistent with the unwritten Constitution. And a year later, it used unwritten principles not to invalidate legislation, but to fill a gap, a lacuna in the Constitution, to suggest that Quebec cannot unilaterally leave Canada. And over the years, so those are two cases, but they're very clear on the law. A, that you have unwritten principles. And B, that you can use them to invalidate and strike down legislation. And then a year and a half ago, there was a case, not about such an important topic, elections in Toronto. Again, I may get it later if I have time. And then the story was this, just like in Israel when you have the Tel Aviv state, right? And there is hatred towards the Tel Aviv state. And the Tel Aviv state is more liberal, more left-wing versus Israel. Same in Canada. So you have the Toronto state, you have the anti-Toronto sentiment. Zmolistan. Wow.
Smolistan.
I see it was more.
Leftistan.
And what happened that the provincial government, there was a clash, and what the provincial government did was to change in legislation the structure of elections to Toronto. Right? So there was a municipal election coming in Toronto. And during the election period, the legislature changed the number of wards, mechuzot, to essentially cut the budget of the city by a half and say that instead of, I forget the numbers, but instead of having, I think, 50 neighborhoods or 50 wards and 50 councillors in the city council, there will be only 25. Which is less money, less power, and so on. And so that was done by legislation, and there was an argument that it violates freedom of expression because then people won't be, because the discussion won't be as robust when you have a little city council. And the court says, no, that's not working. The Charter of Rights doesn't apply to cities. But the question was whether the unwritten principle of democracy, right? Democracy in Canada is an unwritten principle, whether you could use that to say you need a robust discussion on municipal matters. Instead of saying, well, democracy is a principle, but this doesn't necessarily mean that it applies to city, to discussion of municipal matters, the court said, actually, you can't use the principle of democracy to strike down legislation at all. You can use, and the court essentially did 180. It says, the unwritten principles of the Constitution of Canada can be used to interpret the Constitution, but not to strike down legislation. Now, the court had to explain its previous decisions to strike down legislation based on unwritten principles. And then what the court did, instead of saying we are changing our minds, conservatives who don't like this notion of unwritten principles, it said no. Those decisions were based not on the principle of democracy, which is no basis in the text, but on the principle of federalism, which, as in this is for me the most important word in the case, the German case, that the other principles have a strong textual basis. So the court came up with the notion that for there to be an unwritten principle, it has to have some written anchor. And this case is a year and a half. It was given a year and a half ago. We don't know what's going to happen with it later, but it shows us the fragility of the unwritten constitution. Because if the unwritten constitution is based on discovery or creation by judges, it could be undone as fast as it is done. And it will be very interesting to see. As you know, you have studied and imagined the decisions in the Hassan decision, for example. And it will be very interesting to see if the plan of the current government to appoint more conservative judges is successful. We may see that happening here too. Things like, well, the decision in Hassan should be read more narrowly and so on, not because we are overriding it, but because we are interpreting it. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the book. Excellent book and the opportunity to read and learn from it and think about some of the really important questions it raises. And I've been asked to choose a I'll pick a chapter, and I chose a chapter by Karen Shapiro to comment on, which is titled "Change is the Only Constant: Unwritten Amendments in the Court." And what I'll do, I'll present briefly the argument, and then raise two questions of general importance, or generally about constitutional law amendments, and then make a third question and answer it, or make an observation about the application of the argument to Israel or situation. So the argument in the paper, what Shapiro argues, is that for an unwritten amendment to count as an actual amendment, it must bring a new and stable equilibrium. Okay, a new stable constitutional equilibrium, different than what was before, but also stable. And that equilibrium, she argues, is not made by the court itself, but has to have the cooperation of other institutions of society, of government institutions, civil society institutions, and all of those together may create a new equilibrium. And furthermore, the contours of this equilibrium would be decided by a dialogue between the court and those other institutions, or by interaction, interrelations between what the court says and those other institutions. So it's not that the court has the only or even final word. The actual amendment would be an outcome of this dialogue and interrelation, and would be an amendment only if it would be a stable equilibrium. Furthermore, Shapiro has a normative argument that she derives from this descriptive or conceptual argument, and that is that it can be used to deflate some of the arguments of attacking judicial review because it's counter-majoritarian or non-democratic. What she says is that those arguments greatly overestimate the power of the court to amend, let's say, the Constitution or make changes, because the actual changes are made not only by the court, but by this host of societal forces operating together, which together shape those amendments. It's not only the court that's doing the job. Okay. So, in order to exemplify her argument, she uses several examples, but I use two famous cases which she uses to show one as a successful amendment of the unwritten Constitution, the other is a not successful. The first is the Brown case that was already mentioned, and the second is the Roe case. Okay, the Brown case abolishing segregation in school, and the Roe case creating the right for abortion. So as to the Brown case, it was contested at the beginning, but over time, what she argues is that there was actually created a new equilibrium, and right now, as Mark has said, you don't really want to say, you know, let's undo Brown. That's not a tenable argument, but that equilibrium actually incorporates some kind of dialogue. So the way she views that equilibrium is that it incorporates the idea that state official discrimination or segregation is unlawful, that race-based distinction meet with a strict scrutiny, but also that the court is somewhat limited in the tools that it can enforce, through which it can enforce, let's say, desegregation. That's owing to some attempts by the court to be more aggressive in implementing desegregation were unsuccessful. So this is a kind of equilibrium that she applies. Now, as to Roe, she says that's an unsuccessful amendment because there was no new equilibrium, because it was contested at the start, it kept being contested. If at all, the decision has increased the contestation around abortion, it has increased polarization about that point, and this she wrote even before Dobbs, or just when Dobbs was just argued, and Dobbs, of course, overturned Roe altogether. And also she described the way different political and social organizations continuously operated to undo Roe over the time, including courts and lower courts and so on. Okay, so that's basically the argument. Now, the first question I have, and I don't have it's an actual question, and if we'll have discussion, time for discussion, if everyone wants to write to me, I'll be very obliged about it, because I am working on this. This is a research project, is about polarization, something that Mark has also talked about. So I'm co-writing a book about polarization in courts, and the question that arises from these two questions, what makes for a polarizing case, and what makes for a non-polarizing case? So can we have some tools to distinguish or to know or to make sure that courts do not create polarization through their decisions? And again, the project is actually larger in the sense that it includes institutional design. How can we design courts so that they would not end up increasing the polarization? And so a different question is, how can we design courts in an age of polarization, that they can operate in an age of polarization? And I just stipulate that in Israel, we are in an age of polarization. I don't think that's very controversial. So I have only thoughts about this. Okay, so we might think that several elements of judicial decision do increase polarization. The fact that it's dichotomous, it's a yes or no, right? It's justice-based, so it's rather than, it's based on principle of justice, which are harder to compromise on. And it portrays the other side not just as wrong, but as unlawful or unjust. So these things enhance. But there are other things that you can use the court to decrease polarization. The fact that you can deliberate, the fact that the court is independent, it's not political. Maybe it can deflate controversy by channeling them to more pragmatic questions. It may depend, okay? But the question is still there. What makes for a proper doctrine, maybe a proper doctrine of judicial review? And just my last point here is my favorite is, and it turns out to be also the author's favorite, is John Harkavyy's process theory, by which the court should concentrate not on determining values, but on opening the channel of change or allowing and clearing away obstructions on the democratic process that does allow change. But whether that's feasible, to what extent, and how we can use that, these are big questions. Okay, that's the first question. The second question is also a challenge to the normative conclusion that Shapiro arrives at, meaning that this actually can be used to deflate criticism about the counter-majoritarianism. And I think it may create a greater challenge, because what she basically says is, look, you shouldn't worry too much about this counter or non-democratic aspect of non-elected official maybe creating amendments of the Constitution, because they don't do it alone, they do it together. But the question remains, why them at all in this process? So why should we add them to the mix if it's a political mix, right? And this is especially pertinent because we're talking not about interpreting or applying the Constitution, but amending the Constitution, right? We're talking about amending the unwritten Constitution. So it's a political act of changing political reality, right? So we can say that within that political act, courts, they're not alone, they deliberate, that they act with others, but what's institutionally fitting for them to be actors of political change at all? What's a good idea about them doing it? That remains, I think, a challenge. And I just want to emphasize that it's easy for us to think that's a good idea if we agree with what the court does. So why not add them to the mix? If they add some values that we agree with, and we shouldn't worry too much because they're not alone, but if we don't agree, what happens in the U.S. now is that all of those, or many of those writing quite strongly for judicial review are rewriting whatever they wrote now, and basically saying, let's do away with judicial review. That's a bad idea. So, Dorfler, Lemoyne, and others just say, let's, disempower the court. Let's bring democracy back. Why? Because they're not happy with what the court does. So I think the challenge kind of remains, even if the court is not the final word or doesn't have the final word or not the exclusive words. Lastly, I get to Israel. And the question I want to pose here is about, if we think about an unwritten constitutional change and whether it created a new equilibrium, I want to ask this question about the Mizrahi case. Okay? So the famous Mizrahi case of 1995 can be viewed as an unwritten constitutional amendment, creating what is termed the constitutional revolution. Did it create a new stable equilibrium, and therefore, according to Shapiro, can be viewed as an actual amendment? And here I think the answer is unequivocal no. Okay, there is no equilibrium around this, and what we're seeing today is the continuation of an ongoing process of undermining that decision. It has never been non-contested. It's been contested from the start. It took some time for political actors to realize exactly what was at stake, but once they had, they contested it, and they keep contesting it, and it has not created a stable equilibrium. And it might add, if we had polarization, it might have added to polarization as well. Because it made or it enhanced the idea that human rights are subject to political debate and are partisan in a sense. Okay. So we are now at the stage of, the closest we have to changing that amendment, de-amending that unwritten amendment. And I guess the only optimistic thing I can say is that we might, and it's a very big if or hope for a new equilibrium, something that might create an improvement. So I'll end it.
And last but not least, Mila, please.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for having me, and I think this is a fascinating discussion, fascinating topic. I think that it was also a matter of definition here, because I'm not sure that we all agree on what is an unwritten constitution and what is a written constitution. On the other hand, I'm not really sure that it makes a difference. So, for example, on Monday I heard, when I was at the IDI with Yaniv, even though I stayed after he stayed, and I heard Alan Dershowitz, he was interviewed there, and he was just, as a side he mentioned that he taught a course with Aaron Barak, and the course was a simply comparative discussion of written and unwritten constitutions in different jurisdictions and how they fared. And the conclusion that they came to eventually was that there's almost no difference between the two kinds of constitutions in terms of impact and of function. And I think that this makes a lot of sense, certainly with respect to the scope and to the impact of constitutional rights. Since if the recent democratic backsliding can teach us anything, it's that law is seldom guaranteed for the strength or the health of the legal system, and unwritten changes can be as dramatic and as impactful as written changes. And of course, what I want to refer to especially is the courts, and one of the strongest and easiest ways of changing the constitution, the written constitution, in an unwritten manner is by interpretation. And I just want to address several questions regarding interpretation, both in the United States and in Israel. as a tool for safeguarding or, on the other hand, of dismantling human rights. So we all know that constitutional interpretation varies according to the interpreter and what the interpreter wants to achieve. And also, I think we can all agree, at least in this day and age, that conservative interpretations are as activist as liberal ones, and the idea that conservative interpretations are less activist is plainly wrong. As we've seen, for example, in the United States, in the recent decisions of the last term, including, of course, Dobbs. And Mark, you discussed in your chapter Unwritten Constitutions of Different Regimes, and discussing the different regimes in the United States. And there's evidently a struggle currently in the United States about which constitutional regime should win, whether so the court is actually trying to, I think, change the constitutional regime from a liberal constitutional regime to a conservative one. The decision in Dobbs was a very major point in that. And I think the interpretational tool that they're trying to use is this history and tradition tool, in which basically the court in Dobbs held that since the framers of the Constitution didn't think to include the right to abortion in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, because such inclusion goes against the country's tradition, the country's history, there can be no constitutional right to abortion. Now, this is basically, from a feminist perspective, the court saying that since patriarchal religious prejudice against women is an important part of American history and tradition, then it must remain in place unless women can succeed in changing the Constitution to prevent that. A task which obviously is almost impossible in the American context. But let's just for a moment, so this is from the feminist perspective, but let's just for a moment juxtapose this form of interpretation, which relies on history and tradition, with that which is allegedly opposite, an opposite system of interpretation, which is espoused by many liberals, such as Barak and others, which is known as the dynamic or the living constitution, which basically said the constitution should change according to present times, to the present perceptions and practices of society. And of course, this type of interpretation has been used to increase the protection of rights in cases such as Obergefell in the United States. In Israel, we all know most of us know, the important case of Danilovich, which is a case in which also the court has, in fact, created the right for gay couples. It was not the right to marriage, but it was still an extremely important case. But the interesting thing about the argument in Danilovich, and I think it was also mentioned in Obergefell, is that this argument, at least in Danilovich, relied heavily on the constitutional interpretation of rights that haven't been recognized before, and the societal practice and the societal perception, the changing societal practice and the changing societal perception was the most important element which made the court persuaded that we need to recognize those rights. So today, in our current world, this brings us to the question, what happens when society becomes more conservative? What happens to the unwritten constitution? Is it legitimate for those liberal, expansive interpretations which allegedly were, if they were, based on societal perceptions, to change into conservative, restrictive interpretations, and to change to fit with those current practices. And what happens to protection of rights which we offer to women, to gays, other minority groups, if at all. So in Israel, it would probably be accurate to say that society has become, or is becoming more and more restrictive. So for example, would that mean in questions such as the segregation between men and women, the exclusion of women from the public sphere, would that create legitimate reason for that exclusion? And I leave this open. I mean, just to clarify, I don't think it does, but you know, it's a fair point that should be put on the table. And I just want to return to dogs for a second, because this is also a way in which, I mean, if somebody thinks that this is, for example, the dynamic interpretation, which is like a liberal interpretation, if we think it's a legitimate interpretation and it depends on the changing perceptions of society, then I would like to ask what would have happened if the dog's court would have actually used the dynamic interpretation instead of using the conservative history and tradition interpretation. So the court could have said that women's rights to abortion would be or should be decided according to each society's interpretation and practice. And therefore, returning the right of decision to the states would allegedly, which is basically what the 14 dogs did, would allegedly be in line with this type of dynamic living constitution. Now again, I'm only raising, it's not that I agree with this type of interpretation, but I'm just, the reason why I'm saying this is because if we believe, because this exemplifies a real dilemma in progressive interpretations. If progressive interpretations really believe that they need to have something to do with the way society is structured and the way society, the perceptions of society, the practices and beliefs of society, then this kind of inhibits the progress of rights and can actually even take us backwards in many cases. Now, the 14 dogs obviously didn't use the dynamic interpretation to justify its ruling. It used the history and tradition, and this, immediately raises a lot of criticism from liberals. But it is definitely both the liberal and the conservative interpretation could lead eventually to the same result. Thank you.
Maybe I'll say just a few minutes, and then if there are questions or discussion, we can continue for a few minutes. And so first, let me just thank really everyone, Mark for giving the keynote, and Daniel, who spontaneously agreed to come to Herzliya and join the discussion. Of course, all of you, all the commentators who read the book and agreed to comment on it. Let me just maybe say a few minutes and try to bring it to the discussion now on Israel and what's going on these days. So I agree with everything Mark said, and I want to take one point, and that is that eventually depends on a platform that mobilizes people and political action. Because what we've seen in the last few years, we've seen how the conservative right movement in Israel has managed to mobilize people and also to promote ideas in order to change our fundamental values, to bring about a new equilibrium, as Iddo said. Now, unlike Iddo, I don't think that even if we will have a new equilibrium, this would end the story. Because we are in a constant struggle of these harmonic values between the Jewish and democratic values of the state. One part of the country wants to push towards a more universal understanding of the values of the state. The others want to push to a more particular nationalistic values of the state. And this is a constant struggle that will forever bring new and again renewed and other constitutional revolutions. So we had one constitutional revolution, now we are seeing the counter-revolution. And if the new government will bring about a new revolutionary understanding, there will be a backlash and again a counter-revolution again. But this is not unique to Israel. It occurs everywhere. So I think and this is the engine behind constitutional change. That is one point. The second point, Mark mentioned the role of structural change. And I think this is important in the Israeli case because we know how fragile our structure is. And because political action can bring about constitutional change, this is what worries me about some of the changes that we see now. Because I've heard some politicians say, you guys should not be worried, you liberals should not worry, because you can just trust our politicians who would not bring about a fundamental change. And I don't find this very much reassuring, because you don't design a constitutional structure on smoke, trust us. You have nothing to worry. Okay, assuming I trust these politicians, what about the next ones who would come? We need to have a proper constitutional design that will ensure the rules of the game, a genuine democratic game, and not to put all our money just on trusting the politicians. And it doesn't have to be trusting the politicians, we also trusting the court. We need to have proper design, which we don't, we are lacking. The third point, Tsvi mentioned appointing the judges. And I think if I'm trying to connect this with Gila's talk, I think what we're about to see in Israel in the next, hopefully not, but what we might see is that conservative judges in the future will reverse, not the Mizrahi case, but they will reverse the decisions that equality is a protected right under Israeli constitution. Because equality is implicitly derived from human dignity. And it's not explicitly written. Actually, this was the compromise that allowed the enactment of basic human dignity was that equality is out of the package. And in a way, I think it was a strategic mistake for our court to bring equality through the back door. But what we'll probably see, perhaps, is throwing it back from the window. Saying, no, it was a mistake. Equality is not written. And it shouldn't be protected. But I want to take Tzvi's point on the appointing conservative judges to another point, and that is appointing conservative officials. And I want to take us far from Israel to Turkey. In Turkey, secularism was considered to be a fundamental value in the state. This is the vision of Atatürk, right? To have a modern secular republic. And when President Erdogan tried to formally amend the constitution in 2008 to abolish headscarf ban in universities, he wasn't able. The court blocked it. The court told him, you cannot do this formal amendment because secularism is an enshrined value in the Turkish constitution. And then what Erdogan did, he tried to push towards a new constitution. He could have a new constitution-making process. So what he did, he simply captured the administrative person, the head of the Turkish Malad, the head of the chair of the Higher Education Council. He captured that position, put someone of his own. That person wrote a letter to the university and told them, listen, if there are women with headscarf in the university, just don't expel them. And that was the end. So he managed to have what he couldn't do in a formal amendment. He managed to do it in the sub-constitutional level, in the administrative level.
Because there's no such thing as constitution.
And this brings me to the final point, to Daniel's point, that everything is the constitution. I agree. Everything is the constitution, and this brings me to ask Daniel the following question. If we think of the totality of the constitutional order, does this constitutional order has to be a coherent one, in the sense that does this total order rest on specific fundamental values? Does it rest on certain pillars? I think yes, but I'm curious to see what you have to say. And if the answer is yes, does this mean that these pillars are in a way unchangeable? And this brings me to the final point on the Israeli order. If we talk about presuppositions, doesn't our presupposition in the Israeli constitutional order are the Jewish and democratic values of the state? Whether we go to the Declaration of Independence or not necessarily so. I mean, isn't the entire understanding of our Knesset members is that they're acting within a specific, already presupposed constitutional order, which they cannot change? That's perhaps the final. I had more to say. For example, constitutional conventions. We had this debate in Israel about convention and the role of convention. I think one convention that we might have is that the most senior judge is appointed the president of the court. And what we're about to see probably is attempts to change this convention. And I think if there is one convention that is quite easily argued that this really is a convention that has been lasted through time and been obeyed, is this convention. And I think that we will see attempts to change it. I don't think it will be a change so quickly because I don't see members of the court rushing and saying, no, I want to be the president of the court before the most senior one. And I don't see members of the committee for electing judges approving that anyway. So I'm not sure, but this is just, we're talking about convention. I think this is one convention we're about to see in the headlines soon. So thanks again, and let's open it for a discussion. A few more minutes if there are any comments.
Can I answer your question?
Yes.
Very briefly. I think there are fundamental principles. My proof is that long before the United Kingdom adopted the Human Rights Act to encodify the European Convention on Human Rights, pretty much the same principles were applied by the judges. Very much, and not as much has changed as the people who enacted the Act would like to suggest. Now, are those principles immutable? Are they fundamental? Yes, they are. Do they change? No, they don't. But they look different from time to time. So the principle of fairness, the principle of equality, they are fundamental to legality, to the principle of legality. But it was fair 300 years ago for one person to sell another in the market. It is not fair, or except it was fair for there not to be social justice in the form of social security arrangements. And as Professor Graeber pointed out, that is actually now seen as a fundamental principle of fairness in society. It was equal it looked equal to deny people to live the way they liked 300 years ago. It doesn't look equal anymore. So they're the same principles, but they look different, and that's why we need judges who can see how they look from time to time. And that is new.
Yes. Okay, just a small comment. Consider the right to privacy, which was not recognized in the UK until the Human Rights Act, and the Smith, etc. But this is just a comment about the impact of the Human Rights Act on British constitutional law. So that was one issue I wanted to do. I have other comments.
So I just, about equality, to respond to you, continue your point, why do they need to, say that equality is not part of the...
It's in another apply.
No, they will apply it. They'll just interpret it differently.
Yeah.
So they'll simply say, equality, for example, in religions, this happens actually on the international level of interpretation of Sigal. All the religions, the patriarchal religions say women are equal, but they're not. It's not equality; it's equity. So there is equality in difference, right? This is by the way the segregation argument. It's just from and also from a religious perspective. So you say, yeah, they're equal. They just have different functions, different spaces, different this and different that.
Different rights.
similar. I mean, if we go back to Aristotle, he was, formal equality, equality for equals, and different, not equality for different. So women are different than men, Arabs are different than Jews, Palestinians are beyond the pale different. So you can have the cake and eat it too. That's the problem with constitutionalism. This is the strength of the unwritten constitution. You can basically do anything with what is written. We can see it, in the sham constitutions, in the comparative comparison of constitutions around the world. So probably North Korea also has equality in its constitution somewhere, and freedom of speech, and etc., etc. So,
but not freedom after speech.
Or maybe off of what you said, what constitutions and writing does best is kick a set of ideas out of consciousness. So, United States, people are socialized. A presidential system is simply good. Most people will grow up never questioning whether a parliamentary system is better. But it turns out, once you ask the question, the written constitution plays far less of a role. That rather than thinking of constitutions primarily as constrained mechanisms, this goes to your what are the limits, think of them as socializing mechanisms. You grow up, you are trained in a certain environment where you know this is in, this is out, this is debatable.
Tomer, please. By the way, Tomer is an expert on religion. He's also a philosopher.
Thank you for saying that, because I wanted to begin by saying I don't teach law, I'm an expert in law, and certainly I haven't yet read the book, so if I display any ignorance, please forgive me. But what this discussion brings to my mind is Robert Cover's famous distinction between narrative and law, norms and narrative, right? In which the law is a very limited sort of expression of a much wider narrative, which produces the law, and in turn the law enforces and maintains that narrative. Now the narrative changes all the time. And so the law tries to amend itself, and so the narrative is in a way that unwritten constitution, right? That within it the law exists and lives, and taken out, it dies because it's out of context and dead. And taking the Israeli case, by the way, and I totally agree that everybody is, or at least most, are living under the presumption of a narrative of Jewish and democratic. And I think what we're seeing today is that many in the current forming government are, in a way, insisting that they are totally democratic and actually blaming the other side, the Supreme Court, for example, for being undemocratic. And so the narrative, even as it's shifting, is still displaying this sort of same headline, while it is actually changing, and with the narrative changing, the law is also changing.
Iddo, please.
I want to make a general observation that the unwritten constitution discussion brings out. And this is something that I think about when I teach constitutional law in Israel over the years. And that is the fact that Israel did not have a codified constitution. And that's a really international exception at the time. So the UK didn't have historically a constitution, just continued. New Zealand and so on, they just continued. But Israel came into being at the time that everyone had a constitution. So India and every other country being formed after World War II, after colonialism, had a constitution. So
they were desperate for it.
So it really raises the question, why? Or what makes Israel? And there were actually, the conditions were there. There was a promise for a constitution. There was an international obligation for a constitution. Now, and I think that, I know all the stories why it didn't happen, but I think the conundrum stays, like the general. I think it has something to do, maybe with this non-resolved equilibrium and so on, that is very Jewish in a sense, right? We cannot agree on, and that's why I'm not concerned with the dictator for Israel. I'm concerned with anarchy for Israel. The dictator is not so Israeli-like, but anyway, we cannot agree. And running forward, I think what happened in the Mizrahi case, they imposed a necessity for agreeing on a constitution because there wasn't a political will to have a constitution at the time. The court seized on a moment and said, you know, it'll never happen unless I push this forward. And now we're dealing with the necessity of having a constitution, which we didn't have before. Nobody pushed us far enough to deal with it. So this is how I read the historical development.
I completely agree with that, except I think you're being a bit unfair. Israel had the courage to admit that it didn't agree and therefore couldn't formulate a constitution. India didn't agree. Right? Talk to Pakistan about but Israel had the courage to admit that constructive tension is very often the next best thing to, and better than a pretense of an agreement.
In what way did it admit it?
By never coming to do it. By never doing it because it could never happen, because we agree we can't agree.
Well, it wasn't exactly what Ben-Gurion said, but that was obviously correct.
Oh,
Yeah, that's exactly what he said.
Unwrittenly so.
Yeah, but the fact that it's what he said doesn't mean that these were his motives.
Is any of the students have any questions? We have one unwritten principle, that is that everyone must see the quarterfinal. What are we now? Semifinal? Semifinal. So I want to allow the students also to get home to the semifinal. So any of the students has any questions or remarks? And if not, we can just wrap it up and go.
Don't be embarrassed or...
You should be. If not even one, you should be.
No.
Here, Yochai. Who just won a prize, by the way, for the best dance. The second place for the best dance.
Thank you. I just... regarding the strength of the unwritten constitution, maybe it's more flexible. I think it's also maybe its weakness because in my opinion, the whole point of a written constitution is that we can recognize the procedures of how we apply these narratives or the unwritten constitution. And if we skip this procedural part and go straight to applying the unwritten constitution, then what are we doing? Then anyone can say this is the unwritten constitution, and someone else will say this is the unwritten constitution. We have no order, and it's back to anarchy, I think.
I think one of the answers to this is that we all need to write books and somehow make our if we limit our legal understanding just to the written text, then many of us will be out of the job.
But as Mark teaches us, the text is just the beginning, always.
Or rather, yeah. And notice for lawyers, almost none of your study is on those parts of the Constitution that they did exactly what you said. Here's the good news. They said the president comes to power October 20th. You don't study that. You study all people shall have freedom of religion. Well, it turns out there's almost no way, whether you write it down or don't write it down, you can cover the infinite number of circumstances in which people raise freedom of religion claims. So the first thing is there will be a constitution that doesn't neatly correspond with the text on freedom of religion, inevitably. Which of those is authoritative at any time will depend in part on how other constitutional provisions that seem fairly distant from the freedom of expression, how the government is elected, what campaigning looks like. These will play as much of a role in determining what the freedom of religion is as theories of the freedom of religion.
That's it? All right. So thank you, Meital, for chairing. And thank you, Channel Hook and Mishpat, for filming that, for video the session. Thank you, Toda. And thank you very much.
Thank you.